harsh winter of 1289. A 7-year-old girl named Elspeth was sold to the kitchens of Thornwick Castle, not knowing that within those gray stone walls lay the one person who would change the meaning of family forever. Hello, dear friend. Welcome. I'm so glad you've come to settle into the quiet of the evening with me. Let me pour you a cup of something warm in your mind. Imagine it steaming, fragrant with herbs, and let's begin a story that I think you'll want to hear. It's a story about survival and unexpected kindness, about the smallest hands doing the largest work, and about how even in the coldest winters, warmth can be found in the most unlikely places. So nestle in, get comfortable, and let's travel back together to a time when castles rose like mountains against gray skies, and when a child's courage could bloom even in the deepest frost. Her name was Elspeth, though she'd stopped thinking of herself by that name some weeks ago. She was 7 years old, or perhaps 8. She couldn't quite remember anymore, with hair the color of old straw and eyes that had learned to be wary before she'd learned to read. Her small frame was thin in the way of village children who'd known more hunger than plenty, and her fingers were already developing the rough patches that came from work beyond her years. She wore a simple woolen dress that had belonged to someone else before her, someone larger, so it hung on her like a tent, and beneath it, layers of linen that were never quite clean and never quite warm enough. Her feet were bare in the November wind. The skin on her heels cracked and darkened from the journey to the castle. Elspeth didn't remember her mother's face anymore. She knew this was a terrible thing, something that should have made her weep, but she'd learned that tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. What she did remember was the smell of her mother's hair, something like wood smoke and onions, and the feeling of being held, though she couldn't quite picture the arms anymore. 3 years. It had been 3 years since the fever took her, and Elspeth had been passed from relation to relation, a mouth to feed that no one had quite enough for. Her father had been gone longer than that, swallowed up in some dispute over land that she'd never understood, though she remembered her grandmother's bitter voice saying he'd been foolish. Her uncle, her mother's brother, had been the one to bring her to Thornwick Castle. She remembered the morning of it, the way he'd woken her before dawn, pressed a piece of hard bread into her hand, and told her to be ready. She'd thought perhaps they were going to the market. She'd thought, in the small, stubborn way of children, that perhaps he was taking her somewhere better. Perhaps she would finally be wanted. Instead, he'd walked her for 2 days through the brown November landscape, past villages where smoke rose from chimneys and children who weren't sold played in the streets, and he hadn't spoken to her except to tell her to keep up, to hurry, to stop dawdling. On the evening of the second day, they'd come to the castle. It had risen before them like a sleeping giant, all gray stone and narrow windows, enormous in a way that made her understand, finally, that she was very small indeed. The transaction had taken less than an hour. She'd waited in a cold chamber while her uncle spoke with a tall, narrow man whose face bore the red marks of old scars. She remembered her uncle's shoulders relaxing, the way he'd glanced at her with something that looked almost like relief. He'd been given money, a real purse of coins, and he'd left her there without saying goodbye. That had been 4 days ago. 4 days in the kitchens of Thornwick Castle, and Elspeth felt as though she'd been living there for years. The kitchens were vast and hot and loud in a way that assaulted all her senses at once. There was was always a fire burning, a great, monstrous thing that seemed to never rest, and around it moved people who shouted and cursed and occasionally laughed with a kind of recklessness that terrified her. There were 3 other children there, older than her, who knew the rhythms of the place and barely noticed when she arrived. There was Cook, whose name was apparently just Cook, and who had enormous hands and a voice that could shake dust from the rafters. There were several women whose names Elspeth was still struggling to learn, and a boy named Thomas who worked the spit and sometimes showed her where things were when he thought Cook wasn't looking. The first night, she'd been shown to a corner of the kitchen where a thin mat lay on the stone floor, and she'd been told that this was where she would sleep. She'd lain there shivering, the cold rising up from the ground despite the kitchen's fire, and wondered if this was what death felt like. This numbness, this terrible awareness that nothing would ever be quite right again. On her first morning before the sun rose, someone had kicked her awake. It was a harsh nudge of a boot and a voice, one of the women, she thought, saying, "Up with you, child. There's work to do." She'd scrambled to her feet, disoriented and aching, and had been handed a large pot and told to fill it with water from the well outside. The well was impossibly deep, and the bucket was impossibly heavy, and her arms had shaken so badly that she'd nearly dropped it twice. When she'd finally dragged the pot back inside, half of the water had sloshed out, and Cook had called her worthless and told her she'd have to fill it again. She had filled it again. The work was endless. Wake before dawn, so early that the world was still black as pitch, and the cold was so bitter it felt like it might snap off her exposed skin. Fill the water pots, carry wood for the fire, scrub vegetables, turnips mostly, their earthy skins rough against her raw fingers, scour pots, help pluck chickens, the smell making her stomach turn though she'd learned to keep her expression blank. Carry heavy trays of food toward the great hall, though she was usually stopped at the door and the food was handed off to an older servant. Scrub again. Hour after hour of scrubbing, her hands in cold water so often that they never quite dried out, and the skin between her fingers began to itch and crack. The cold was the worst of it, though. November in the north was nothing like the mild autumn she half remembered from her village. The wind came down from the mountains and seemed to pass through the stone walls of the castle as though they were made of nothing. The kitchen was warmer than the other parts of the castle. Thomas had told her that servants elsewhere almost never left their tasks because they were so cold. But it was still cold. A bone-deep, endless cold that made her teeth ache constantly. At night, on her thin mat, she curled into herself so tightly that her muscles would ache the next day. She was hungry. This was something she'd known before in the months between her mother's death and when her uncle had brought her here, but it was different now. The hunger was constant and specific. She watched the food being prepared and imagined eating it, imagining the feel of hot bread in her mouth, the richness of butter, the sweetness of honey. The servants ate once a day, usually a thick pottage made from the scraps of whatever was being prepared for the castle folk. It was lumpy and often tasted of burned things, but Elspeth ate it like it was ambrosia, trying to make it last, knowing that this was all there would be until tomorrow. On her third day, she'd made a mistake. She'd been so tired, barely able to keep her eyes open, and she'd accidentally knocked a full bowl of milk into the fire. It had hissed and steamed, and the smell had been terrible, and Cook had come running. For a moment, she'd thought she would be hit. Cook's hand had come up and Elspeth had flinched, closing her eyes, bracing for pain. But the hand had stopped, and after a moment, Cook had just sighed, a long, tired sound, and told her to clean the mess and be more careful. It was this moment, strangely, that had broken something inside her. Being hit might have been better somehow. Being hit would have meant that her suffering meant something, that she was being punished for a specific thing. But this sigh, this tired resignation, this acknowledgement that she was just one more problem to deal with, had made her understand, finally, that she was truly alone. No one here loved her. No one would. She was a tool, useful only insofar as she was able to work, and the moment she became a burden, she would be discarded. She'd gone into the corner after that when she had a moment alone, and she'd cried. She'd cried silently, in the way she'd learned, the way of children who know that crying aloud only brings more punishment. She'd cried until her eyes were swollen, and then she'd dried her tears on her thin sleeves and gone back to work. It was on her 4th day that she met Margaret. The kitchens were particularly chaotic that morning because there was a visiting lord coming, a man of importance who would be staying several days, and everything needed to be perfect. Cook was even more frantic than usual, snapping orders, and the women were moving in quick, efficient movements that suggested they'd done this many times before. Thomas was working the spit, turning a whole pig that had been sent up from the cellars, and the smell, rich and complex and utterly maddening to Elspeth's empty stomach, filled the entire kitchen. Elspeth had been assigned to peel onions, which was, she discovered, one of the worst tasks in the kitchen. The smell made her eyes water constantly, and her fingers burned from the sharp oils. She was standing at a long wooden table, surrounded by hills of papery skins, when a shadow fell across her work. "You," a voice said, not Cook's voice, someone else. Someone older, perhaps, but not angry. "What's your name?" Elspeth had looked up, startled. A woman was standing there, not one of the regular kitchen servants, but someone different. She was perhaps in her 50s, with gray streaking her dark hair, and she wore a more substantial dress than the kitchen workers, something that spoke of a higher position. Her face was lined in a way that suggested she'd smiled often, even if she wasn't smiling now. Elspeth had managed. "My name is Elspeth." "And how long have you been here?" "4 days, if it pleases you." The woman nodded slowly, studying her. "I'm Margaret. I run the household here, the servants and the servants' servants, everything that keeps this castle standing." She'd paused, and then she'd done something that had made Elspeth's breath catch. She'd taken the onion from Elspeth's hands, looked at her reddened fingers, examined the cracks and the raw spots, and had sighed. "Come, you need something for these hands or you'll get an infection." Elspeth hadn't known what to do. She'd followed Margaret out of the kitchen, through a narrow corridor, and into a small room that smelled of herbs and kept things. Dried plants hanging from the rafters, jars of salves, clean clothes folded neatly. Margaret had worked her hands gently in warm water with something in it that smelled of lavender, and then she'd applied a salve that was so cooling and soothing that Elspeth had almost cried again, though this time from a different emotion entirely. "There," Margaret had said, "that will help. You need to let them dry properly and keep them wrapped when you can. Who brought you here?" "My uncle, he." He sold me." Margaret had made a small sound, not quite a sigh, not quite a grunt. "Yes, well, that's the way of it sometimes." She'd been wrapping Elspeth's hands in clean linen, her movements efficient but not unkind. "You're too small for the heavy work they're giving you, and too young to have those hands yet. How old are you?" 7 or perhaps 8. "You should be 7, Margaret had said matter-of-factly. "That's young enough. You've got years ahead of you." She tied off the wrapping and had smiled then, a real smile that had transformed her face entirely. "Listen to me, Elspeth. This place is hard. It will test you, but it's not the worst place to be a servant child. There's food enough and there's work, and that work will teach you things you'll need to know. And there are people here who are cruel, certainly, but there are also people who are not. Can you understand that?" Elspeth had nodded, not entirely sure that she did understand, but wanting to believe it. "I think perhaps you'll do all right," Margaret had continued. "If you're careful, if you're smart, if you don't make the same mistakes twice, and if you learn to listen to what people need before they have to tell you." She tilted Elspeth's chin up with one finger, forcing her to meet her eyes. "Can you do that?" "I can try," Elspeth had whispered. And that had been that, except it hadn't been. Because after that, things had shifted, just slightly, but perceptibly. When Elspeth struggled with a heavy pot, Thomas would appear and help her carry it. When Cook snapped out an order that made no sense, Margaret would simply catch Elspeth's eye and nod, clarifying what was actually wanted. And once, when Elspeth had accidentally torn the hem of her dress and had been convinced she'd be punished, Margaret had simply sewn it up while she was working, saying nothing, expecting nothing in return except that the work would continue. It was this last act of kindness that had changed everything for Elspeth, because it had shown her something that she hadn't believed before, that adults could be kind for kindness's sake alone, that someone could help you and not require you to be grateful, that the world contained unexpected pockets of warmth even in the coldest seasons. The castle had become slightly less terrifying, not pleasant exactly, but less unbearably grim. She still woke in the dark. She still worked until her arms ached and her fingers cramped. She still went to bed hungry more often than not. But now there was this other thing too, the knowledge that she had noticed her, that she had been seen by someone and hadn't been found wanting. She had become a person to Margaret, not just a problem to be solved. And as December crept closer and the cold deepened, Elspeth found herself, cautiously, beginning to notice things again. She noticed the way the light came through the high kitchen windows in the late afternoon, turning the stone gold. She noticed the smell of rosemary when Cook made the sauce for the venison. She noticed that Thomas was funny, making small jokes to the other servants when Cook wasn't looking, and that the women had a kind of partnership, the way they moved around each other in the kitchen without collision, the way they sometimes whispered together and sometimes laughed quietly, a sound like bells. She noticed that she was still alive, and that being alive, even like this, was better than the alternative. Her name was Elspeth, though she'd stopped thinking of herself by that name some weeks ago. She was 7 years old, or perhaps 8. She couldn't quite remember anymore, with hair the color of old straw and eyes that had learned to be wary before she'd learned to read. Her small frame was thin in the way of village children who'd known more hunger than plenty, and her fingers were already developing the rough patches that came from work beyond her years. She wore a simple woolen dress that had belonged to someone else before her, someone larger, so it hung on her like a tent, and beneath it, layers of linen that were never quite clean and never quite warm enough. Her feet were bare in the November wind. The skin on her heels cracked and darkened from the journey to the castle. Elspeth didn't remember her mother's face anymore. She knew this was a terrible thing, something that should have made her weep, but she'd learned that tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. What she did remember was the smell of her mother's hair, something like wood smoke and onions, and the feeling of being held, though she couldn't quite picture the arms anymore. 3 years. It had been 3 years since the fever took her, and Elspeth had been passed from relation to relation, a mouth to feed that no one had quite enough for. Her father had been gone longer than that, swallowed up in some dispute over land that she'd never understood, though she remembered her grandmother's bitter voice saying he'd been foolish. Her uncle, her mother's brother, had been the one to bring her to Thornwick Castle. She remembered the morning of it, the way he'd woken her before dawn, pressed a piece of hard bread into her hand, and told her to be ready. She'd thought perhaps they were going to the market. She'd thought, in the small, stubborn way of children, that perhaps he was taking her somewhere better. Perhaps she would finally be wanted. Instead, he'd walked her for 2 days through the brown November landscape, past villages where smoke rose from chimneys and children who weren't sold played in the streets, and he hadn't spoken to her except to tell her to keep up, to hurry, to stop dawdling. On the evening of the second day, they'd come to the castle. It had risen before them like a sleeping giant, all gray stone and narrow windows, enormous in a way that made her understand, finally, that she was very small indeed. The transaction had taken less than an hour. She'd waited in a cold chamber while her uncle spoke with a tall, narrow man whose face bore the red marks of old scars. She remembered her uncle's shoulders relaxing, the way he'd glanced at her with something that looked almost like relief. He'd been given money, a real purse of coins, and he'd left her there without saying goodbye. That had been 4 days ago. 4 days in the kitchens of Thornwick Castle, and Elspeth felt as though she'd been living there for years. The kitchens were vast and hot and loud in a way that assaulted all her senses at once. There was always a fire burning, a great, monstrous thing that seemed to never rest, and around it moved people who shouted and cursed and occasionally laughed with a kind of recklessness that terrified her. There were 3 other children there, older than her, who knew the rhythms of the place and barely noticed when she arrived. There was Cook, whose name was apparently just Cook, and who had enormous hands and a voice that could shake dust from the rafters. There were several women whose names Elspeth was still struggling to learn, and a boy named Thomas who worked the spit and sometimes showed her where things were when he thought Cook wasn't looking. The first night, she'd been shown to a corner of the kitchen where a thin mat lay on the stone floor, and she'd been told that this was where she would sleep. She'd lain there shivering, the cold rising up from the ground despite the kitchen's fire, and wondered if this was what death felt like. This numbness, this terrible awareness that nothing would ever be quite right again. On her first morning before the sun rose, someone had kicked her awake. It was a harsh nudge of a boot and a voice, one of the women, she thought, saying, "Up with you, child. There's work to do." She'd scrambled to her feet, disoriented and aching, and had been handed a large pot and told to fill it with water from the well outside. The well was impossibly deep, and the bucket was impossibly heavy, and her arms had shaken so badly that she'd nearly dropped it twice. When she'd finally dragged the pot back inside, half of the water had sloshed out, and Cook had called her worthless and told her she'd have to fill it again. She had filled it again. The work was endless. Wake before dawn, so early that the world was still black as pitch, and the cold was so bitter it felt like it might snap off her exposed skin. Fill the water pots, carry wood for the fire, scrub vegetables, turnips mostly, their earthy skins rough against her raw fingers, scour pots, help pluck chickens, the smell making her stomach turn though she'd learned to keep her expression blank. Carry heavy trays of food toward the great hall, though she was usually stopped at the door and the food was handed off to an older servant. Scrub again. Hour after hour of scrubbing, her hands in cold water so often that they never quite dried out, and the skin between her fingers began to itch and crack. The cold was the worst of it, though. November in the north was nothing like the mild autumn she half remembered from her village. The wind came down from the mountains and seemed to pass through the stone walls of the castle as though they were made of nothing. The kitchen was warmer than the other parts of the castle. Thomas had told her that servants elsewhere almost never left their tasks because they were so cold. But it was still cold. A bone-deep, endless cold that made her teeth ache constantly. At night, on her thin mat, she curled into herself so tightly that her muscles would ache the next day. She was hungry. This was something she'd known before in the months between her mother's death and when her uncle had brought her here, but it was different now. The hunger was constant and specific. She watched the food being prepared and imagined eating it, imagining the feel of hot bread in her mouth, the richness of butter, the sweetness of honey. The servants ate once a day, usually a thick pottage made from the scraps of whatever was being prepared for the castle folk. It was lumpy and often tasted of burned things, but Elspeth ate it like it was ambrosia, trying to make it last, knowing that this was all there would be until tomorrow. On her third day, she'd made a mistake. She'd been so tired, barely able to keep her eyes open, and she'd accidentally knocked a full bowl of milk into the fire. It had hissed and steamed, and the smell had been terrible, and Cook had come running. For a moment, she'd thought she would be hit. Cook's hand had come up, and Elspeth had flinched, closing her eyes, bracing for pain. But the hand had stopped, and after a moment, Cook had just sighed, a long, tired sound, and told her to clean the mess and be more careful. It was this moment, strangely, that had broken something inside her. Being hit might have been better somehow. Being hit would have meant that her suffering meant something, that she was being punished for a specific thing. But this sigh, this tired resignation, this acknowledgement that she was just one more problem to deal with, had made her understand, finally, that she was truly alone. No one here loved her. No one would. She was a tool, useful only insofar as she was able to work, and the moment she became a burden, she would be discarded. She'd gone into the corner after that when she had a moment alone, and she'd cried. She'd cried silently, in the way she'd learned, the way of children who know that crying aloud only brings more punishment. She'd cried until her eyes were swollen, and then she'd dried her tears on her thin sleeves and gone back to work. It was on her fourth day that she met Margaret. The kitchens were particularly chaotic that morning because there was a visiting lord coming, a man of importance who would be staying several days, and everything needed to be perfect. Cook was even more frantic than usual, snapping orders, and the women were moving in quick, efficient movements that suggested they'd done this many times before. Thomas was working the spit, turning a whole pig that had been sent up from the cellars, and the smell, rich and complex and utterly maddening to Elspeth's empty stomach, filled the entire kitchen. Elspeth had been assigned to peel onions, which was, she discovered, one of the worst tasks in the kitchen. The smell made her eyes water constantly, and her fingers burned from the sharp oils. She was standing at a long wooden table, surrounded by hills of papery skins, when a shadow fell across her work. "You," a voice said, not Cook's voice, someone else. Someone older, perhaps, but not angry. "What's your name?" Elspeth had looked up, startled. A woman was standing there, not one of the regular kitchen servants, but someone different. She was perhaps in her 50s, with gray streaking her dark hair, and she wore a more substantial dress than the kitchen workers, something that spoke of a higher position. Her face was lined in a way that suggested she'd smiled often, even if she wasn't smiling now. Elspeth had managed. "My name is Elspeth." "And how long have you been here?" "4 days, if it pleases you." The woman nodded slowly, studying her. "I'm Margaret. I run the household here, the servants and the servants' servants, everything that keeps this castle standing." She'd paused, and then she'd done something that had made Elspeth's breath catch. She'd taken the onion from Elspeth's hands, looked at her reddened fingers, examined the cracks and the raw spots, and had sighed. "Come, you need something for these hands or you'll get an infection." Elspeth hadn't known what to do. She'd followed Margaret out of the kitchen, through a narrow corridor, and into a small room that smelled of herbs and kept things. Dried plants hanging from the rafters, jars of salves, clean clothes folded neatly. Margaret had worked her hands gently in warm water with something in it that smelled of lavender, and then she'd applied a salve that was so cooling and soothing that Elspeth had almost cried again, though this time from a different emotion entirely. "There," Margaret had said, "that will help. You need to let them dry properly and keep them wrapped when you can. Who brought you here?" "My uncle, he sold me." Margaret had made a small sound, not quite a sigh, not quite a grunt. "Yes, well, that's the way of it sometimes." She'd been wrapping Elspeth's hands in clean linen, her movements efficient but not unkind. "You're too small for the heavy work they're giving you, and too young to have those hands yet. How old are you?" 7 or perhaps 8. "You should be 7, Margaret had said matter-of-factly. "That's young enough. You've got years ahead of you." She'd tied off the wrapping and had smiled then, a real smile that had transformed her face entirely. "Listen to me, Elspeth. This place is hard. It will test you, but it's not the worst place to be a servant child. There's food enough and there's work, and that work will teach you things you'll need to know. And there are people here who are cruel, certainly, but there are also people who are not. Can you understand that?" Elspeth had nodded, not entirely sure that she did understand, but wanting to believe it. "I think perhaps you'll do all right," Margaret had continued. "If you're careful, if you're smart, if you don't make the same mistakes twice, and if you learn to listen to what people need before they have to tell you." She tilted Elspeth's chin up with one finger, forcing her to meet her eyes. "Can you do that?" "I can try," Elspeth had whispered. And that had been that, except it hadn't been. Because after that, things had shifted, just slightly, but perceptibly. When Elspeth struggled with a heavy pot, Thomas would appear and help her carry it. When Cook snapped out an order that made no sense, Margaret would simply catch Elspeth's eye and nod, clarifying what was actually wanted. And once, when Elspeth had accidentally torn the hem of her dress and had been convinced she'd be punished, Margaret had simply sewn it up while she was working, saying nothing, expecting nothing in return except that the work would continue. It was this last act of kindness that had changed everything for Elspeth, because it had shown her something that she hadn't believed before, that adults could be kind for kindness's sake alone, that someone could help you and not require you to be grateful, that the world contained unexpected pockets of warmth even in the coldest seasons. The castle had become slightly less terrifying, not pleasant exactly, but less unbearably grim. She still woke in the dark. She still worked until her arms ached and her fingers cramped. She still went to bed hungry more often than not. But now there was this other thing too. The knowledge that she had been seen by Margaret, that she had noticed her and hadn't been found wanting. She had become a person, not just a problem to be solved. And as December crept closer and the cold deepened, Elspeth found herself, cautiously, beginning to notice things again. She noticed the way the light came through the high kitchen windows in the late afternoon, turning the stone gold. She noticed the smell of rosemary when Cook made the sauce for the venison. She noticed that Thomas was funny, making small jokes to the other servants when Cook wasn't looking, and that the women had a kind of partnership, the way they moved around each other in the kitchen without collision, the way they sometimes whispered together and sometimes laughed quietly, a sound like bells. She noticed that she was still alive, and that being alive, even like this, was better than the alternative. December arrived like an unwelcome guest who intended to stay forever. The temperature dropped so sharply that on the first true freezing morning, Elspeth woke to find that the water in the great pot beside her mat had formed a skin of ice. She'd stared at it for a moment, her breath visible in clouds before her face, and had felt something close to despair settle over her. This was only the beginning. The castle transformed. It seemed to contract around itself, all the outer doors and windows shuttered against the cold, the corridors becoming a maze of shadows and drafts. The servants huddled closer together, moving more quickly, their breath perpetually visible, their fingers perpetually numb. In the kitchens, the fire became everything, the center of the universe, the thing around which all life orbited. To stand near it was a privilege granted sparingly. To have your turn to warm your hands for even a minute was considered a luxury beyond measure. Elspeth's mat in the corner became unbearably cold. She would curl up on it at night, shivering so violently that she sometimes wondered if her body would simply seize up completely, turning to ice, and that would be the end of it. The other children seemed to handle it better. They'd been here longer, their bodies perhaps more accustomed to deprivation, but even they moved more slowly in December, spoke less, conserved every bit of energy for the work that had to be done. Thomas found her one morning in the second week of December, crying silently beside the well. She'd been sent to break the ice that formed overnight, and she'd managed to break her thumbnail doing it, and the pain had combined with the cold and the hunger and the relentless, grinding exhaustion to crack something in her. She was sitting on the frozen ground, her hand bleeding into the snow, and she couldn't stop crying. He sat down beside her without saying anything. He was perhaps 14, all growing limbs and knees that seemed too large for his body, with a shock of red hair and freckles across his nose. He'd been kind to her, in the casual way that suggested it cost him nothing, but she'd never been alone with him before. "My sister died last winter," he said finally, his voice quiet. "She was younger than you, 3 years old. She was sick for 6 days and then she was gone. I remember thinking that the cold was killing her, that if we could just get her warm enough, she'd be all right. But it wasn't cold. It was everything. The cold and the hunger and being small and having no one to really protect you. All of it together, it just broke her." Elspeth looked at him, unsure why he was telling her this. "I'm telling you because I want you to know that you're doing better than she did," he continued. "You're getting stronger even though it doesn't feel like it. I've been watching you. You're learning. And if you can make it through this winter, you'll make it through anything. The winters after this will seem mild to you. You'll know that you survived this, and that means you can survive almost anything." "Why are you being nice to me?" Elspeth asked, her voice small and thin as a reed. Thomas shrugged. "Because my sister isn't here to be nice to, and because Margaret asked me to watch out for you, but also just because you're trying so hard and that matters to me, even if no one else notices it." After that, Thomas became something like her protector, though he was careful about it. He didn't make it obvious, but he ensured that when the servants ate their thin pottage, her bowl was perhaps fractionally fuller than it might otherwise have been. When she faltered at a task, he would appear beside her and help without making it seem like help, just working alongside her until the task was done. Once, in the deep cold of mid-December, she woke to find an extra blanket over her mat, one that he must have smuggled from somewhere, and when she tried to thank him the next day, he simply shook his head and told her to keep it hidden, that she mustn't let anyone know. Margaret, too, became her steady point in the chaos. The housekeeper moved through the castle like someone accustomed to managing the impossible, and she did so with a kind of grace that seemed almost heroic to Elspeth. Every morning, she would find Elspeth and examine her hands, checking to make sure the salve was being applied, that the cuts weren't worsening. She would bring her small things, a bit of honey one day, a piece of good bread another, never enough to be noticed, always carefully hidden as though it were contraband. She would sometimes simply touch the back of Elspeth's head as she passed, a small gesture of acknowledgement that meant somehow, someway, that Elspeth was known. It was Margaret who explained the castle's rhythm to her, the way things worked during winter in a place like Thornwick. She did this in fragments, bit by bit, usually while they were working on something together. "The Lord and his family retreat to the solar," Margaret told her one evening in early December as they checked the stores in the larder. "That's the warmest room in the castle, the only one where they keep a proper fire. The servants there wear layers of wool and spend their days moving between the solar, the kitchen, and the great hall. They're warmer than the rest of us, but in their own way they're trapped. Can't move freely, always have to be presentable. Elspeth was learning to read the castle's social structures, the invisible hierarchies that determined everything from where you slept to how much you ate. There were the castle folk, the lord's family and their immediate servants, who lived in relative comfort in the upper reaches of the castle. There were the skilled servants, the steward, the master of horse, the armorer, who had their own small chambers and privileges. And then there were people like Margaret who occupied a strange middle ground, respected for their competence but still fundamentally servants. And at the very bottom were people like Elspeth, children sold into servitude, the disposable ones, the ones who could be replaced without much thought. "But here's what you need to understand," Margaret said to her, and she gripped Elspeth's shoulders so that their eyes met. "The position you're in now, as hard as it is, gives you something that the Lord's children don't have. It gives you the truth. You're learning how things really work, how a castle actually stands. You're learning to work, to persevere, to notice things. These are things that matter far more than fancy clothes or a warm solar." Elspeth wasn't entirely sure she believed this, but she held onto it anyway. The way she held onto the memory of her mother's smell. The way she held onto the knowledge that somewhere, someone had seen her and deemed her worth saving. The winter deepened. Snow came, beginning gently in mid-December, and then increasing until there were days when Elspeth couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the castle walls. The village beyond the castle had largely disappeared, swallowed by white. The wind howled around the stone walls constantly, a sound that became so familiar that silence would have seemed strange. Inside the castle, everything moved more slowly, as though the cold had slowed time itself. In late December, there was a festival of sorts, a celebration for the Lord and his family and the most important servants. Elspeth didn't participate in this directly, but she saw its effects. There was special food prepared, spiced wine, dried fruit, honey cakes made with precious spices that must have been brought from somewhere very far away. The smell of them permeated the kitchens, and Elspeth found herself unable to stop thinking about them, though she knew that none of this food was for people like her. But on the night of the celebration, after the Lord and his family had retired, Margaret found her in the kitchen and pressed something into her hand. It was a piece of honey cake, small enough to fit in her palm, still warm. Elspeth looked at it and then at Margaret, her eyes wide. "Eat it," Margaret said simply, "and don't tell anyone. This is just between us." Elspeth had held that piece of honey cake for a long moment, turning it over in her fingers, trying to decide if it was real. Then she'd put it in her mouth, and her eyes had widened even further. It was the most complex taste she'd ever encountered. The honey, the spice cinnamon. She would learn later from hearing Cook discuss it. The delicate sweetness of it. The way it melted on her tongue and seemed to warm her from the inside out. She'd closed her eyes and savored it, trying to make it last, even though it was gone in seconds. When she opened her eyes, Margaret was smiling at her, a real smile full of warmth. "You see," Margaret said, "there are small things, small moments. They don't make the hard parts go away, but they help. They remind you that there's still beauty in the world, still kindness, still things worth surviving for." After that, the winter seemed somehow less impossible. Not easy, nothing about it became easy, but it became something that she could imagine enduring. She began to understand that survival wasn't about one moment, one day, or one season. It was about a series of small moments, small acts of kindness, small instances of warmth. Her mother's hands holding her. Thomas appears with an extra blanket. Margaret's voice saying her name like it mattered. The taste of honey cake on her tongue. January was the worst month. The cold reached a depth that seemed to penetrate the stone walls themselves. There were mornings when the inside of the castle was nearly as cold as the outside, when breath came out in great clouds of frost, when even moving seemed to ache. 2 of the older servants fell ill. The sickness seemed to be something that lived in the cold itself, spreading through the castle like a living thing. One of them, a woman named Ellen, seemed to recover after a few days of fever and coughing. The other, a man named Grayson who worked in the stables, got worse instead of better. Elspeth saw him only briefly, when Margaret brought her to his small chamber in the servants' quarters to help change the straw on his bed. He was thin and hollow-eyed, and his coughing had a wet, terrible sound to it. Margaret moved around him with efficiency and gentleness both, changing his bedding, giving him water to drink, whispering things that might have been prayers or might have been comfort. "Will he die?" Elspeth asked later after they'd left his room. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know. The sickness takes some and leaves others. It's partly the cold, partly the body's own strength. He was older and the cold winters are harder on older bones, but he has the will to live and that matters sometimes." Grayson didn't die, though he came close. For 3 days his coughing was terrible, and the servants moved around the castle with the knowledge that death was in their midst, that it could choose any of them. But on the 4th day his fever broke, and slowly over the next weeks he began to recover, though he would never be quite as strong as he'd been before. It was this experience that shifted something in Elspeth's understanding. She realized that the castle, for all its stone and its size and its permanence, was fragile. The people within it were fragile. They could be taken away at any moment. And in the face of this fragility, the kindnesses became even more precious. Margaret's careful tending of Grayson, the other servants bringing him warm broth, Thomas sitting with him for hours. These things mattered not because they were guaranteed to save him, but because they were gestures of resistance against the cold and the dark and the possibility of disappearing unmourned. February came with a kind of grim certainty. This was the month when supplies always ran low, when the stores of grain and dried vegetables and preserved fruits began to dwindle in a way that made the steward anxious. The servants' rations were reduced slightly, not enough to be noticeable in a single day, but enough that over the course of a week, Elspeth found herself increasingly hungry. Her body had begun to adapt to the regular meals she'd been having in the castle, and now the reduction felt like a particular cruelty. It was in February, too, that she had her first real encounter with harsh punishment. She'd been carrying a heavy pot of water from the well, and she'd slipped on ice in the courtyard, falling hard on her hip and spilling the water everywhere. The pot itself was fine, but the water was gone, and they would need to refill it, and it was cold, and Cook was already irritable about the poor supplies. When she made it back to the kitchen, Cook had taken one look at her, at the empty pot, at her tear-streaked face, and had hit her. Not with fists, but with a wooden spoon, hard enough across her back that Elspeth had fallen to her knees. It hadn't been the worst beating she'd ever experienced. Her uncle had been worse, but it had been startling in its viciousness, and it had broken the fragile hope that she'd been building. She'd run away after that, deeper into the castle, finding a small alcove near the stairs where no one ever went. She'd curled up in the corner and had cried with an intensity that frightened her, cried as though her heart was breaking, as though all the losses of the past months were suddenly rushing back at her at once. Margaret found her there after perhaps an hour. She didn't ask questions. She simply sat down beside her and pulled her close, and Elspeth, overwhelmed by this unexpected kindness, had wept against Margaret's shoulder for a long time. "You need to understand something," Margaret said finally, when Elspeth's sobs had quieted to occasional hiccups. "Cook isn't a bad man, not really. He's terrified. The stores are low and he doesn't know if there will be enough to get through until spring. He's afraid, and fear makes people cruel. That doesn't make it right, but it's the truth. And I won't let him beat you again. If he does, you come to me. Do you understand?" "Why do you care about me?" Elspeth asked. "I'm nobody. I'm just a child servant." "Because you're a person," Margaret said simply. "Because you're trying so hard. And because my youngest died when I was a young woman, and I've regretted every day since that I couldn't protect her, couldn't save her. I can't change what happened to her, but I can try to protect you. That's my choice." Elspeth had looked up at her, seeing the sadness in her face, understanding that Margaret carried her own wounds, and something had shifted in her understanding of the world. She realized that kindness wasn't weakness. It came from strength. It came from having survived enough to understand what mattered and choosing to let that understanding guide your actions. After that night, Elspeth became more careful, but also more bold. She began to anticipate Cook's moods, to understand when he was frustrated and needed someone to simply absorb orders without question, and when he might snap. She began to learn the small tricks that the other servants knew, how to make a thin pottage feel thicker and more nourishing if you stirred it properly, how to find the warmer corners of the kitchen and position yourself there when you had a moment. She began to understand that servitude wasn't something that happened to you. It was something you managed. And she began to understand Margaret's role in the castle. The housekeeper wasn't just managing servants. She was managing the impossible. She was trying to keep a castle functioning through the hardest season, trying to keep people alive and healthy and capable of work, trying to maintain the peace and order that allowed everyone to survive. It was a monumental task, and watching Margaret move through it day after day filled Elspeth with a kind of awe. One afternoon in late February, when the snow outside was still deep, but had taken on a kind of grayish crust that suggested spring might eventually come, Elspeth was helping Margaret inventory the remaining stores. They were in the larder, a cold room deep in the castle's lower levels where the food was kept. The walls were lined with barrels and hanging bundles of herbs and preserved vegetables and wheels of cheese wrapped in cloth. "We'll make it," Margaret said, running her hands along the inventory. "It will be close, very close, but we'll make it through to spring. There will be people who go hungry. The Lord and his family will continue to eat well because that's how things are, but the servants will have enough to survive. That matters. That's all any of us can really do. survive and help others survive, and try to do it with some measure of dignity. She turned to Elspeth then, and she took her small hand in her larger one. "You're going to survive, Elspeth. I'm going to make sure of it. And one day you're going to look back on this winter and realize that you were stronger than you ever thought possible. That it broke you, perhaps, but not in a way that kept you broken. You'll be remade by it. You'll understand things about yourself and about the world that others never will." Elspeth wasn't sure she believed this, but she held on to it anyway. March came like a slow awakening. The snow began to soften, the days to lengthen. The cold was still bitter, but it was a cold with an ending to it now, a cold that everyone could see would eventually release its grip. In the castle, things shifted. People moved a little faster, worked a little harder because the end was in sight. The stores in the larder were nearly depleted, but not quite. They would make it. And somehow, Elspeth had made it too. By the middle of March, when the first green shoots began to push through the melting snow, she realized that she had survived the winter. She'd been in the castle for nearly 4 months. Her dress was still worn and shabby, but it fit her better now, had molded to her growing form. Her hands were still rough, but they'd also become skilled. She could prepare food quickly and efficiently, could manage the heavy pots without trembling, could move through the kitchen's rhythms as though she'd always belonged there. But more than that, something inside her had changed. The person she'd been when she arrived, terrified, uncertain, sure that she was completely alone, had been refined and tempered by the winter. She was tougher now, yes, but she was also somehow gentler. She understood suffering now in a way that only those who'd truly experienced it could. And she understood kindness too, understood that it was precious and rare and worth treasuring. Thomas found her one morning in early spring, hanging herbs from the rafters to dry. He looked at her and smiled, and she realized that she'd learned to smile back. "You made it," he said. "I made it," she agreed. "I knew you would," he said. "I could tell on that day by the well, you had something in you, a kind of stubborn will to keep going. That's the thing that survives winters. Not strength necessarily, just stubbornness. And you have plenty of that." Later that day, Margaret asked to speak to her privately. They went to the small room with the herbs, and Margaret sat down across from her. "I wanted to tell you what comes next," Margaret said. "You've done well this winter, very well. And I think it's time you learned more of the castle, more of the work. I'm going to move you out of the kitchen, at least for part of your day. I want you to help me manage the servants' quarters, to learn how to keep the chambers clean and organized. You'll still help in the kitchen. We can't spare you entirely, but you'll have more varied work." This was, Elspeth understood, a promotion of sorts. It meant she was being recognized as capable, as someone worth training. "Why?" she asked. "Because I think you could be a good housekeeper someday if you continue to work hard and pay attention," Margaret said. "Because I think you have the kind of mind that notices things, understands how things work. And because I want you to have more than just this." She gestured around the kitchen. "I want you to have possibilities." Elspeth felt something warm bloom in her chest. For the first time since she'd arrived at the castle, she felt as though perhaps she had a future. Not just a series of days to survive, but something that stretched ahead of her with shape and possibility. Spring at Thornwick Castle was like watching the world remember how to breathe. The snow melted into great rushing streams that flowed down from the mountains and through the village below. The grass, dormant and pale beneath the snow, began to turn green again. And within the castle walls, there was a kind of cautious celebration, a sense that they had endured, that they had made it through another year. The work changed as the seasons shifted. The kitchen, which had been the center of life during winter, became somewhat less intense. There was more food available now, fresh greens from the beginning of the vegetable stores, eggs from the chickens who'd weathered the winter, milk from the cows who'd been brought in from the fields where they'd been wintering. Cook's moods improved noticeably, and though he was still quick to criticize, there was less of the desperate edge that had characterized his manner during the depths of winter. But Elspeth was no longer spending all her time in the kitchen. True to her word, Margaret had begun training her in other aspects of castle management. Several mornings a week, instead of arriving in the kitchen before dawn, Elspeth would meet Margaret in the servants' quarters, a sprawling section of the castle on the ground floor where the household servants slept and spent their rare moments of leisure. It was in these quarters that Elspeth began to understand the deeper structures of castle life. There was a hierarchy even among servants, invisible but rigid. The older servants occupied the largest spaces, had the best access to the small fires that were lit during the coldest months. The younger servants, like Elspeth, were crowded into the smaller chambers. And there were ranks within even this. The steward servants ranked above the kitchen servants, who ranked above the general servants, who ranked above the children. But Margaret moved through this hierarchy as though it barely existed for her. She spoke respectfully to everyone, from the eldest servant, a woman named Alice who'd been at Thornwick for nearly 40 years, to the newest arrivals. She treated them all as though their comfort and well-being mattered, which was a radical thing in a world where servants were generally viewed as tools to be used until they broke. The secret to managing people, Margaret told Elspeth one morning as they worked together to air out the blankets from the winter stores, is to understand that everyone wants roughly the same things. They want to feel that their work matters. They want to be treated with basic decency. They want to know that if they're ill, someone will notice and care. They want to feel like they belong somewhere. These things don't cost anything, really, but people will work harder and more faithfully if they feel them. Elspeth was learning to see the castle not as a monolithic thing, but as a living organism made up of many smaller organisms, all of them trying to survive together. There was the Lord and his family, living in their warm solar, largely disconnected from the daily workings of the place. There was the steward, a precise man named Robert who managed the accounts and the broader logistics of the castle. There was the master of horse, a gruff but fair man named William who oversaw the stables and the knights. There was the armorer, the blacksmith, the baker who had his own small establishment outside the castle walls. And then there were the vast networks of servants who kept it all functioning. Margaret seemed to know all of them, seemed to understand their strengths and weaknesses, and most importantly, seemed to understand how to keep all of these disparate parts working together. When there was conflict, and there was often conflict, small tensions that could grow into larger problems if not addressed, Margaret would step in with a quiet word, a gentle redirection, a solution that seemed to benefit everyone. One morning in April, Elspeth witnessed a confrontation that would have terrified her a few months earlier. One of the kitchen servants, a woman named Beatrice, had apparently stolen something from one of the Lord's daughters, a ribbon or a handkerchief, something small but valuable. The Lord's daughter had discovered the theft and had come to the steward in tears, and there was the very real possibility that Beatrice would be severely punished, perhaps even dismissed from the castle with no reference, which would make it nearly impossible for her to find work elsewhere. But Margaret had intervened. She'd asked to speak to both the Lord's daughter and Beatrice, and she'd done so privately. What had transpired in that conversation, Elspeth never fully learned, but the result was that the ribbon had been returned. Beatrice had apologized, which seemed to satisfy the Lord's daughter, and the matter had been closed. Later, when Elspeth asked Margaret how she'd managed it, the housekeeper simply smiled. Beatrice's mother had just died, Margaret explained. She received word of it in March, but she couldn't afford to leave to attend the funeral. She was grieving, and in that grief, she wasn't thinking clearly. As for the Lord's daughter, she's not a cruel girl, just a young one. She wanted the ribbon back, and she wanted an apology. She didn't want Beatrice's suffering. Once I helped her understand that Beatrice was suffering already, she was happy to let the matter rest. But she stole, Elspeth said, still uncertain. She did, Margaret agreed. And theft is wrong. But humans are complicated, Elspeth. They do wrong things sometimes for reasons that are understandable, even if they're not justified. The key is to respond to the person, not just the action. To understand the whole of their situation and not just the single moment of their failure. This way of thinking was so different from anything Elspeth had previously known that it took her time to absorb it. In her village, and even in her uncle's house, there had been clear rules. You did what you were told, or you were punished. You followed the path you were born to, or you suffered. There had been no room for context, for understanding, for any consideration of the human being behind the action. But Margaret was teaching her that there was another way. Not a way without rules or consequences, but a way that tried to understand people before judging them. It was a revelation, and it changed how Elspeth moved through the world. As spring turned into early summer, Elspeth's duties expanded further. Margaret began to bring her into even more sensitive work. She started having her accompany her to the solar, where they would do the deeper cleaning of the Lord's family's rooms. This was prestigious work. Most servants never entered these spaces, and it meant Elspeth began to have a more direct, if distant, view of the family she served. The Lord was a man named Thomas, apparently, which had amused both Elspeth and the kitchen Thomas greatly. He was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair and a tendency to frown when he thought no one was looking. He was, Margaret explained, a fair lord, which apparently meant that he didn't unnecessarily punish his servants and paid reasonable wages to his skilled workers. That's not nothing, Margaret had said. Many lords are far worse. His wife was the Lady Catherine, a thin woman with kind eyes who spent much of her time in the solar reading or doing fine embroidery. She rarely left her chambers except to attend church on holy days. She seemed perpetually sad about something, though Elspeth could never quite identify what. And there was their youngest child, a daughter named Mirabelle, who was perhaps 16 years old. She had her mother's kind eyes and her father's determined expression, and she seemed to spend most of her time looking out the windows as though wishing to be somewhere else. One afternoon in May, while Elspeth was cleaning the solar with Margaret, Mirabelle had asked for her help with something. The young lady's embroidery frame had gotten tangled, and her fingers were too large and too clumsy to undo the knot in the thread. She'd looked at Elspeth's small fingers with a kind of desperation. "Can you help me?" she'd asked, and there had been something so genuinely uncertain about the question, despite the obvious difference in their stations, that Elspeth had immediately agreed. Elspeth's fingers had indeed been small enough to work the knot free, and as she did, she'd found herself looking at the embroidery itself. It was beautiful, a tapestry of flowers and birds in shades of blues and greens. It was nearly finished, and the work was exquisite, the kind of thing that took hours and hours of patient attention. "It's beautiful," Elspeth had said before she could stop herself. Mirabelle had looked at her, really looked at her, and had smiled. "Do you know how to embroider?" "No, I can't read or write either," Elspeth had said, and then had immediately regretted saying it. It felt like admitting a terrible failing. But Mirabelle hadn't looked at her with pity or condescension. Instead, she'd been thoughtful. "Would you like to learn? I could teach you. It's not difficult. Just patience, really, and the ability to see how things fit together." Elspeth had looked at Margaret, unsure whether she was allowed to say yes. Margaret had given an almost imperceptible nod. "Yes," Elspeth had said, "I would like that very much." And so began something entirely unexpected. Beginning in early summer, on certain afternoons when her other duties were finished, Elspeth would go to the solar with Margaret, and while the housekeeper supervised the older servants in their work, Elspeth would sit with Mirabelle and learn to embroider. It was painstaking work, requiring an intensity of focus that was almost meditative. The needle had to go precisely, the thread had to be the right tension, the colors had to be arranged just so. At first, Elspeth's stitches were crude and uneven. Her fingers, calloused from kitchen work, were not naturally graceful. But slowly, over days and weeks, something shifted. The stitches became smaller, more even. Her fingers learned to move with intention and grace. The work became less about struggling against the materials and more about listening to them, understanding what they wanted to do and helping them do it. It was while she was learning to embroider that Mirabelle began to talk to her. Not in the way that a lady would normally talk to a servant, but as though they were two people who happened to occupy different stations, but who had things in common nonetheless. Mirabelle was, Elspeth learned, deeply unhappy. She was being betrothed to a man she'd never met, a lord from the south who she would have to marry in the autumn. She would leave Thornwick, leave her family, leave everything she'd ever known, and go to a strange castle with a strange family and try to make a new life. "I'm terrified," Mirabelle had admitted one afternoon in June. Her needle paused in the middle of a particularly delicate flower. "And I don't even know why I'm telling you this. You probably have your own problems. You probably think I'm spoiled for being upset about marrying a lord." "I don't think that," Elspeth had said carefully. "You're going to a place where everything is strange and you don't know anyone. That sounds terrifying." Mirabelle had looked at her with surprise, as though she hadn't expected Elspeth to actually understand. "Yes, exactly that. And everyone keeps telling me it's an honor, that I should be grateful, that this is what my life is for. And I understand that. I do understand it, but I'm still terrified." "I was terrified when I came here," Elspeth had offered. "Terrified that I would never be good enough, that I would be alone forever. And I was right to be terrified mostly. It was hard. It is hard. But I'm still here, and I'm not alone anymore. I have Margaret, and I have Thomas, and now I have you. It's not what I would have chosen, but it's not nothing." Mirabel had looked at her for a long moment, and then she'd set down her embroidery and had done something entirely unexpected. She'd hugged her. She'd hugged a servant girl, violated every convention of their world, and simply held her for a moment. "Thank you," Mirabel had said. "I think I needed to hear someone say that I could be terrified and still be all right." After that, something between them had shifted. Mirabel still had all the privileges and protections of a noble woman, and Elspeth was still a servant, but there was now a kind of thread between them, a connection that acknowledged their shared humanity. As the summer progressed, Elspeth's life took on a kind of rhythm and balance that she'd never imagined possible. Her mornings were still largely spent in the kitchen, though the work was less brutal now, less desperate. The afternoons she spent with Margaret, learning the work of managing the household. And several times a week, she would spend time with Mirabel, learning to embroider and listening to the young lady's worries and hopes. Thomas continued to watch out for her, and by summer, they developed an easy friendship. He was working toward becoming a full servant in the Lord's household rather than a kitchen worker, and he was ambitious in a quiet way, determined to rise in the world. He would tell Elspeth about his plans, about learning to serve at table, about eventually perhaps becoming a steward's assistant. "You should think about what you want," he told her one afternoon as they were fetching water from the well. "You're not stuck in the kitchen forever, you know. Margaret's taken you under her wing, and she's important. If you keep learning, keep paying attention, you could end up managing the household someday. You could have a real position." "That seems impossible," Elspeth had said. But even as she said it, she found herself wondering if perhaps it wasn't. Perhaps, after all, the world was not quite as fixed as she'd thought. By midsummer, something had happened to Elspeth that she barely recognized. She was perhaps no longer quite so afraid. The castle had become familiar, not comfortable exactly, but comprehensible. She understood its rhythms and its politics. She knew where to go, what to do, how to navigate the complexities of servant life. More than that, she had relationships now, people who cared whether she lived or died, who would notice if something happened to her. One particularly warm evening in July, Margaret had taken her up onto the castle walls. It was unusual. Servants didn't generally go to the upper parts of the castle, but Margaret had a key to the door, and no one had stopped them. From the top of the walls, they could see for miles. They could see the village below, the river beyond it, the mountains rising in the distance. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of gold and orange and deep purple. The air was warm and carried the smell of the valley, grass and water and growing things. "I brought you here to remind you of something," Margaret had said, standing beside her. "Do you see all that world out there? You're connected to it. You're part of it. You're not just trapped in this castle. You're part of something much larger. And whatever happens, whatever difficulties come, whatever challenges you face, you'll always be able to remember that you're part of a world much bigger than your suffering. Elspeth had stood there for a long time, looking out at that vast world, feeling something settle inside her. It was peace, perhaps, or at least the possibility of peace. It was the understanding that while she might not have chosen her path, the path itself wasn't necessarily a bad one. She could be a servant here and still have dignity. She could have work to do and still have worth. She could have lost much and still have found something. "Thank you," she'd said finally, "for showing me this, for saving me." "You saved yourself," Margaret had replied. "I just kept you alive long enough for you to do it." As summer turned into late summer and then toward autumn, the castle began preparing in earnest for the coming wedding. Mirabelle would be married in October, and there was much to do. The great hall was to be prepared, tapestries to be brought out, special foods to be arranged. It was all the castle had been able to talk about for weeks. For Mirabelle, the approaching wedding was a mix of excitement and dread. She was genuinely happy, Elspeth could see, about the preparations themselves, the new gowns being made, the attention being paid to her, the sense that her life was beginning. But she was also quietly terrified in a way that grew as the date approached. Elspeth found herself being drawn more and more into Mirabelle's confidence. The young lady would ask for her during the afternoons, and they would sit together in the sun, and Mirabelle would talk about her fears. "He sounds nice enough," Mirabelle had said one afternoon in late August. "Father has exchanged letters with him, and by all accounts he's a reasonable man. Not unkind, apparently. But what if we don't suit? What if we have nothing in common? What if he expects me to be someone I'm not? What if you're exactly who he needs you to be?" Elspeth had offered gently. Mirabelle had smiled sadly. "That's very optimistic for someone who has experienced so much hardship, Elspeth. Where does that optimism come from?" Elspeth had thought about this carefully. Where did it come from? She'd been sold by her uncle, separated from everything she knew, brought to a cold castle in the depths of winter with nothing and no one. And yet, she'd survived, and more than survived, she'd found kindness and purpose and people who cared about her. "It comes from knowing that good things can happen," Elspeth had said finally. "It comes from knowing that if I survive the worst of it, then I can probably survive most things. And it comes from knowing that even when things are hard, there are still moments of beauty, like learning to embroider, for instance, like knowing you, like understanding that people are capable of such kindness if they choose to be." Mirabelle had set down her embroidery and had looked at Elspeth with real wonder. "You're remarkable, do you know that? You're just a child, and you've already learned more about life than most people learn in a lifetime." In early September, a rider had arrived at the castle with news from Mirabelle's betrothed. He'd sent a letter describing his home, his estates, his hopes for their marriage. He'd also sent a gift, a bolt of beautiful silk, deep blue shot through with gold threads, enough to make a wedding dress. When Margaret and Elspeth were asked to help sort through the castle's treasures to find additional decorative items for the wedding, Margaret had brought Elspeth to a small storage chamber where the castle's finest things were kept. There were were tapestries of great beauty, plates and goblets of silver, bolts of expensive cloth. "The Lady Catherine used to spend hours in here, I've heard," Margaret had said quietly as they looked through the items. "Before she became sad, before she retreated to the solar and stopped living the rest of her life. It's a tragedy, really, to have so much beauty and then to stop being able to see it." Elspeth had been struck by the sadness in Margaret's voice. She'd realized that there was a whole history to the castle, relationships and stories and sorrows that she would probably never fully understand. The castle was not just a physical structure. It was a repository of human experience. The wedding itself was a grand affair, the largest event that had occurred at Thornwick Castle in the years since Elspeth had arrived. Families from nearby estates came to celebrate. There was feasting and music and dancing. The great hall was transformed into something magical, hung with tapestries and lit with dozens of candles. Elspeth, of course, was not invited to the actual ceremony or the feast, but she was involved in the preparations. She helped serve the food alongside the more senior servants. She helped dress Mirabelle that morning, and she'd been struck by how beautiful the young lady looked in her wedding gown, how nervous and hopeful and brave all at once. Mirabelle had taken her hand just before she went to the chapel, away from anyone's sight. "You've been braver than I'll ever be," she'd said. "You've already survived more than most people will in their whole lives. I hope that means I can survive this." "You'll be fine," Elspeth had said. "You're kind and you're intelligent, and you have the ability to make people feel that they matter. Those things will carry you through." Mirabelle had left and Elspeth had watched her go, feeling a strange mixture of emotions. She was happy for Mirabelle, happy that the young lady was getting a new life, even if it would be lived far away. But she was also sad because Mirabelle had become something like a friend, and now she was leaving. That evening, as the celebrations continued, Elspeth had found Margaret in a quiet corner. "She's going to be all right," Margaret had said, as though reading Elspeth's thoughts. "She's going to be far more all right than you might think. She has good instincts and she's learned some things from you that will serve her well. You don't always understand the impact you have on people, Elspeth. You should know that." After the wedding, life in the castle shifted again. Mirabelle was gone and the castle seemed quieter without her. But autumn was coming and there was work to be done preparing for the winter ahead. By this point, Elspeth had been at Thornwick for more than a year. She'd survived an entire year, which meant she'd survived a full winter and the whole turning of the seasons. She was no longer quite so small, though still thin by the standards of people who'd always had enough to eat. Her hands were still rough, but they were skillful now. Her face had lost the desperate look it had worn when she'd arrived and had gained instead a kind of thoughtful steadiness. Margaret began to give her more responsibility. She started training her in more detailed aspects of household management, how to keep the accounts for the servants' stores, how to manage the assignment of chambers, and how to arrange the schedules of cleaning and maintenance work. It was clear that Margaret was preparing her for something, though she didn't say what. One afternoon in late September, Margaret took her on a long walk through the castle, something that had become a kind of ritual between them. They went through the great hall, the kitchens, the servants' quarters, the storage chambers. They went up the stairs to the solar, down to the dungeons, which were mostly empty and used for storage now. Margaret explained through the chapel. "I'm getting older," Margaret had said suddenly as they were walking. She'd stopped in the middle of one of the corridors and Elspeth had stopped beside her. "I'm not old yet, but I'm older than I used to be. And I'm thinking about what comes next, about what I want my life to be, what I want to leave behind." "What do you mean?" Elspeth had asked, though she thought perhaps she already knew. "I mean that I want to make sure that when I'm gone, there will be someone here who understands how things work, who cares about the people who live in this castle, who will try to manage things with some measure of kindness and intelligence. I mean that I want to train you to do this work, to eventually become something like what I am." Elspeth had stopped walking, stunned. "I can't do that. I'm a servant. I'm a child." "You're a child now," Margaret had agreed. "But you won't always be. In a few years, you'll be a young woman. In a few more years, you'll be a woman. And if you continue to learn and pay attention and develop your skills, there's no reason you can't become the head of household staff here. It's not something that's written in stone. People move up in the world if they have the intelligence and the determination to do so." "But I can't even read," Elspeth had said, and it was true. In all her time at the castle, no one had taught her. "Then we'll teach you," Margaret had replied. "I'll teach you. We'll start small, simple letters, numbers for the accounts. It will take time, but time is something we have." And so, in the evenings after the day's work was done, Margaret had begun to teach Elspeth to read and to write. They would sit in Margaret's small chamber with a candle burning, and Margaret would show her letters scratched on a piece of board with charcoal. It was slow work, and Elspeth's progress was halting at first, but she discovered that she had a hunger for this knowledge that was almost like hunger for food. Reading opened up the world in ways that she hadn't anticipated. By late autumn, Elspeth could read simple words and could write her own name. Margaret had begun to have her look at the household accounts to help her manage the numbers and the tracking of supplies. It was no longer a mystery, this work that had seemed so complex. It was just a matter of paying attention and understanding the logic of it. As winter approached again, her second winter at Thornwick, Elspeth found that she was no longer afraid of it. She knew what to expect now. She knew how to work with the cold, how to manage resources, how to take care of herself and help others take care of themselves. She had learned so much in a year. And more than that, she had learned that she had worth, that she was someone who could be loved and valued. That kindness was a real thing that existed in the world, that could be given and received without consequence or hidden cost, that she had the ability to affect others, to matter to them, that the world, while still hard and often unfair, also contained unexpected pockets of grace. On the first day of the new winter, when the first snow began to fall, Elspeth stood in the courtyard and watched it. She watched the flakes come down, each one different, each one perfect in its own way. She thought about where she'd been a year ago, about the terrified child who'd arrived at this castle thinking that her life was over. That child had been wrong. Her life hadn't been over. It had been transformed, and there was still so much ahead of her. Margaret came and stood beside her, and they watched the snow together in comfortable silence. "Do you think you'll stay?" Margaret asked finally. Will you continue here, learn this work, perhaps eventually take my place?" Elspeth thought about the question carefully. The castle was no longer a prison to her. It was a place where she had skills, where she was respected, where she had purpose. But more than that, she thought about what else might be possible. There was a whole world beyond these walls, a world she'd barely glimpsed. "Yes," she said, "but not forever. I think I want to stay for now to keep learning. But someday I might want to see what else is possible. I might want to know other places." Margaret had smiled at that. "That's good. That's the right answer. Because the most important thing I can teach you is not just how to manage a household, but how to manage your own life. How to know when to stay and when to go. How to make choices that are true to yourself. And you'll be capable of that, Elspeth. That much I'm certain of." The second winter was gentler than the first, though Elspeth understood by now that winter in the north was never truly gentle. It was simply a matter of degree. The cold was still bitter. The stores still seemed inadequate. The darkness still pressed in from all sides. But she was stronger now, and the work was more familiar, and perhaps most importantly, she was not alone in it. Thomas had moved up to serve in the great hall now, and while Elspeth saw him less frequently, when they did encounter each other, there was an easy companionship between them. He had become something like a brother to her, someone whose presence simply meant she was seen and remembered. Margaret continued to teach her, both through direct instruction and through the work itself. She began to involve Elspeth in conversations with the steward, the master of horse, and other senior staff. Elspeth would sit quietly and listen, learning not just what decisions were made, but why they were made, what factors had to be considered, how one had to balance the needs of different people against the limitations of resources and circumstance. It was in midwinter that Elspeth encountered her first real moral dilemma as someone with some small authority. One of the younger servants, a girl named Constance who was perhaps 12 years old, had been caught stealing bread from the kitchen stores. It was a serious infraction. Theft could result in being sent away from the castle with no reference, which essentially meant begging or prostitution or some other form of survival that was too horrible to contemplate for a young girl. Margaret brought her to Elspeth and told her to decide what should be done. At first, Elspeth had thought this was a test of her, a way to see if she'd learned the lessons that Margaret had been trying to teach her. But then she understood that it wasn't a test at all. Margaret genuinely wanted her to make this decision. Elspeth had asked to speak to Constance privately, and she'd asked her why she'd stolen the bread. The girl had told her, with her voice barely above a whisper, that her younger brother had become ill, that she'd been sending bread to him and her mother in the village, that her brother had needed the food to recover. Elspeth had felt the weight of this knowledge settle on her shoulders. She understood why Constance had stolen. She also understood that stealing had to have consequences, or the discipline of the castle would collapse entirely. She'd gone to Margaret and told her what she'd learned. Together, they'd gone to the steward and had proposed a solution. Instead of being sent away, Constance would be given additional work, and a portion of her small stipend, which servants were sometimes given in coins or goods, would be withheld to pay back the bread she'd stolen. But also, they would quietly arrange for some additional food to be sent to her family, ostensibly as charity from the castle, though really it was Margaret and Elspeth finding ways to help without undermining the need for rules. The steward had agreed, and Constance had been relieved, grateful, and thoroughly chastened. She'd become one of the most conscientious workers in the castle after that, eager to show that she'd learned her lesson. That was well done, Margaret had told Elspeth afterward. You understood that rules matter, but so does compassion. You understood that there were multiple things to be held at once, the need for discipline and the reality of Constance's circumstances. That's the kind of wisdom that comes from having experienced suffering yourself. That's why you'll be good at this work. As the winter wore on, Elspeth found that she was taking on more and more responsibility. Margaret began consulting her about decisions before making them. She started asking Elspeth's opinion on how to handle situations. It was a gradual process, so gradual that Elspeth sometimes didn't notice it happening. But by spring of her second year at the castle, she'd essentially become Margaret's assistant in all but name and title. In late March, as the snow was beginning to melt again, something unexpected happened. A rider arrived at the castle with a message for Elspeth. It was from Thomas, not the kitchen Thomas, but her uncle, the man who had sold her to the castle. The letter was written in an uncertain hand and was read to her by the steward. Her uncle was sick, it seemed, dying by the sounds of it. He'd wanted to make his peace before he went, and he'd sent to ask if she would come to see him. He'd even sent money for her travel and her keep, money that he said he felt he owed her. Elspeth had stood in Margaret's chamber holding the letter and had felt a complex tangle of emotions. There was anger, certainly, at her uncle for selling her, for abandoning her, for treating her like she was worth nothing. But there was also something else. There was the understanding that he'd been desperate, that he'd made a choice from desperation, that he was now seeking forgiveness before he died. "What do you want to do?" Margaret had asked gently. "I don't know," Elspeth had said. "Part of me wants to ignore it, to not go. Part of me wants to go and tell him exactly what I think of what he did to me." "And the third part?" Margaret had asked, because Margaret always knew there were more than two options. "The third part wants to go and understand why he did it. I want to see him before he dies and know that I forgave him, not because what he did was right, but because I'm strong enough now to let go of the anger." "Then perhaps you should go," Margaret had said. "I can manage here without you for a few weeks. The work won't fall apart, and you deserve to have this closure. You deserve to know that you can stand in front of the man who caused you such pain and choose forgiveness anyway." And so, in early April, when the roads were just becoming passable again, Elspeth had left the castle for the first time since arriving there nearly 2 years earlier. She traveled with a merchant who was heading toward the coast, and for 3 days she'd lived in a different world, seen different places, talked to different people, and existed outside the confines of the castle walls. Her uncle's village was much as she remembered it, small and poor and hard. Her uncle himself was living in a tiny cottage with an older woman who he apparently paid to care for him. He was thin and yellowed and dying in a way that was obvious to anyone who looked at him. When he saw Elspeth, he'd wept. "I've never forgiven myself," he'd told her, his voice thin and reedy. "I told myself I had no choice, that you would have starved anyway, that at least the castle had food and a roof. But I knew even then that I was lying to myself. I knew it was cowardice. I couldn't bear to see you suffer, so I made you someone else's problem." Elspeth had sat beside his bed, and she'd listened to his confession, and she'd found that she could, indeed, forgive him. Not because what he'd done was right, but because she understood now that people were complicated, that desperation could make people do things they'd regret, that even people who hurt you were human and capable of suffering. "I forgive you," she told him simply, "and I want you to know that I'm all right. I'm more than all right. I'm going to be well. I'm going to have a good life. You don't have to worry about me anymore." Her uncle had died 3 days later in the early morning with his hand in hers. She'd sat with him as he passed, and she'd felt not anger but a strange kind of peace. He had been a broken man carrying his own wounds, and now he was finally at rest. She could let him go. The woman who cared for him, her name was Ellen, had asked if Elspeth wanted to stay longer and wanted to help settle his affairs. But Elspeth had known, with the certainty of someone who'd found where they belonged, that it was time to return to the castle. She'd given Ellen some of the money her uncle had sent, along with her blessing, and she'd set out again toward Thornwick. On the road back, traveling with a different merchant, Elspeth had had time to think about everything that had changed. She'd been sent away from her village as a nobody, as an unwanted mouth to feed. She'd been sold for a handful of coins, and in the space of 2 years she'd become someone with skills and knowledge, someone with purpose, someone who was valued and loved. The castle, which had seemed like a prison, had become something much more complex. It was both a place of work and a place of meaning. It was where she'd learned who she could be. When she arrived back at Thornwick in late April, Margaret had been waiting for her at the gate. The housekeeper had embraced her, something she'd never done before, and Elspeth had felt tears come to her eyes, not sad tears, but tears of gratitude for this woman who'd seen her potential when she was just a frightened child. Elspeth remained at Thornwick Castle, and the years that followed were filled with gradual transformation. By the time she was 13, she was managing much of the daily work of the household under Margaret's supervision. By 15, she was consulting with the steward on matters of supply and strategy. By 18, she was the de facto head of the servants' household, though Margaret still held the official title. Margaret grew older, her hair turning entirely gray, her movements becoming slower. But instead of retiring, she simply began to give Elspeth more and more responsibility, until one winter when Elspeth was 20 years old, Margaret fell ill with a fever much like the one that had taken Grayson so many years earlier. This time, Elspeth was the one who tended to her. She sat by Margaret's bed through the fever, keeping her cool with damp cloths, bringing her water to drink, whispering encouragement and gratitude. When the fever finally broke and Margaret began to recover, the housekeeper had taken her hand. "I think my time is coming," Margaret had said quietly. "Not this winter perhaps, but soon, and I want to make sure you're prepared. I want the steward to formally recognize you as my successor. Will you accept it?" "Yes," Elspeth had said without hesitation. "If you think I'm ready." "You've been ready for years," Margaret had replied. "You just needed to believe it yourself." The formal recognition came in the spring. At a gathering of the castle's senior staff, the Lord himself announced that Elspeth would become the new head of household management, with Margaret staying on in an advisory capacity for as long as she was able. It was an unusual choice. Servants rarely rose to such positions, and a woman even more rarely. But Thornwick's lord was a fair man who valued competence above tradition, and by this point, everyone in the castle knew that Elspeth was the most competent person for the job. Margaret lived for 5 more years after that, and they were good years. She spent them training Elspeth in the final, subtle aspects of managing a household, how to navigate politics among the nobility, how to handle conflicts that arose from outside the castle, how to maintain one's own integrity while working within a system that often rewarded compromise. When Margaret finally died, peacefully in her sleep on a mild summer evening when Elspeth was 25 years old, it felt like the end of an era, but it also felt like a completion. Margaret had given her what she'd promised: a life, a purpose, a legacy of kindness and competence that would extend beyond her own existence. Elspeth had wept, but she had not despaired. She had learned from Margaret that all things end, and that was all right. What mattered was what you did with the time you were given and the impact you had on the people around you. She took over Margaret's title and her chamber, and she continued the work of managing the castle's household. She was fair and demanding, kind but not weak, and the servants respected her. They respected her because they knew that she understood their lives. She had lived them herself. She knew what it was like to be hungry and cold and frightened. She knew what it was like to have no one. And she worked always to ensure that the servants under her care were treated with dignity, and that they had what they needed to survive and even, sometimes, to thrive. Thomas, the kitchen boy who'd watched out for her, eventually became the steward's assistant and then a steward himself at a neighboring castle. He married a woman from the village and had children of his own. But he never forgot Elspeth, and sometimes he would return to Thornwick and they would talk about the old days, about surviving that first terrible winter together. Constance, the girl who'd stolen bread, eventually became a skilled cook and later opened a small bakery in the village. She never forgot that Elspeth had shown her mercy instead of punishment, and she always credited that moment as the turning point in her life. Mirabel, Elspeth's noble friend, wrote letters to her from her husband's castle, long letters describing her new life, her children, her growing comfort with her position. She'd had a daughter first, and then a son, and in her letters she sometimes mentioned teaching them to embroider, showing them the same patience that she'd learned from Elspeth. When Mirabel's first daughter turned 10, she sent her to Thornwick to be trained in household management by Elspeth herself. The girl stayed for 2 years and learned not just skills, but also a philosophy of kindness and competence that would shape her entire life. Elspeth never married, though she was proposed to several times, by men who saw in her a respected, skilled woman with access to the resources of a castle. She declined them all politely but firmly. She had learned that she did not need a man to complete her life, that her work and her relationships and her own development were enough. Instead, she devoted herself to the castle and to the people in it. She worked to improve the conditions of the servants, to ensure that children were not worked too hard, to create a system where people could advance based on merit and effort rather than accident of birth. She established a small school where servant children could learn basic reading and numbers from the castle's chaplain. She created a rotation system so that servants had days of rest, something that was not commonly done, but that she understood from her own experience was necessary for human survival. By the time Elspeth was 50 years old, Thornwick Castle's household was known throughout the region as being unusually well organized and harmonious. People came to study how she managed it. Other households tried to replicate her methods. And slowly, through the work of many people, the treatment of servants and servant children began to improve. Elspeth lived to be 73 years old, which was a long life for that time. She worked nearly until the end, and when she finally stepped down, it was to hand over the position to one of the young people she'd trained, a boy born to servant parents who'd shown the same kind of keen intelligence and moral integrity that Margaret had once recognized in her. On the evening of her final day of work, the servants gave her a celebration. They'd made her favorite foods and they brought her gifts: a fine shawl, a pair of soft boots, a book, carefully chosen to show their gratitude and affection. There were tears from both Elspeth and from many of the people who'd worked under her. And there were stories, people recounting the moments when her fairness or her kindness had changed the trajectory of their lives. One young woman, a servant who'd been born in the castle, took her hand and said something that made Elspeth cry in a way she rarely did. "You showed us that we could be more than our circumstances. You showed us that being born a servant didn't mean we had to be less than human. Thank you for that." That night in her small chamber, the same chamber that had once been Margaret's, Elspeth looked back over her long life. She thought about the terrified 7-year-old girl who'd arrived at the castle with nothing, expecting nothing, believing that she was fundamentally worthless. She thought about the woman she'd become, skilled, capable, respected, and most importantly, someone who had been loved and who had loved in return. She thought about Margaret, who had seen potential in that frightened child and had taken the time to nurture it. She thought about Thomas and Constance and Mirabel. She thought about all the hundreds of people whose lives she'd touched, the servants she'd helped, the children she'd guided, the community she'd helped to build. Life, she understood now, was not about the circumstances of your birth. It was about what you did with the circumstances you were given. It was about resilience and hope and the willingness to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. It was about kindness, both the kindness you were shown and the kindness you chose to show to others. The winter of 1341 came gently that year, and Elspeth welcomed it without fear. She'd survived so many winters by now, through so many changes and transformations. She sat by the great kitchen fire, the same fire where she'd worked as a child, the same fire that had been both cruel and comforting, and she smiled as she watched the younger servants moving through the familiar rhythms of their work. A little girl, no more than 7 or 8 years old, came to the fire to warm her hands. She was new, Elspeth could tell. She had that particular look of a child just arrived, frightened and uncertain, convinced that the world had ended. Elspeth recognized herself in that face, and she remembered Margaret's kindness, and she did what Margaret had once done for her. She took the girl's hand gently and examined her fingers, which were already red from the cold and the work. She smiled at her and said, "Come, let me show you where we keep the salve. Your hands shouldn't hurt this way. Come." And as she led the girl away, teaching her what Margaret had once taught her, Elspeth understood that this was the greatest legacy any person could have. Not fame or wealth or even a name remembered in history, but the knowledge that she had made a difference, that she had eased suffering, that she had shown someone, and through that someone, generations more, that the world contained kindness and grace, and that it was always possible to transcend the circumstances of your birth and become something more than you'd ever imagined. The fire crackled and glowed, warming the kitchen, warming the hands of the servants who labored there. And in the warmth of that fire, in the continuation of that simple act of kindness passed from one generation to the next, Elspeth's story continued on, not as her individual story anymore, but as part of the great, unfolding story of human resilience and the power of compassion to transform the world. The winter of 1341 was long and cold, as winters in the north always are. But within the walls of Thornwick Castle, it was also a season of warmth, and that warmth, once kindled, would never truly go out. The end. Dear friend, as you drift now into sleep, let this story settle into your dreams. Remember that Elspeth's journey was long, but it was made bearable by moments of kindness, small gestures, gentle words, the simple act of one person choosing to see another as worthy of care. Remember that resilience is not about having an easy path. It's about continuing to walk even when the path is hard. Remember that you, like Elspeth, are stronger than you know, capable of surviving what seems unsurvivable, and worthy of kindness both from others and from yourself. Sleep well, rest deeply, and know that like the fire in Thornwick's kitchen, warmth and light continue to exist in the world, waiting to be found and shared. Good night, dear one. May your dreams be